Wheel of Time is a unique fantasy series in that its core premise is change doesn't exist. Spoiler alert if you don't know this already, but the concept of time in this series is bound to a wheel which constantly weaves the same pattern through each chronological age. These ages last for several thousand years, and there's no definite measurement for them, but there is some information about them scattered throughout the series, and in this video, we'll be exploring all of it. So, without any further ado, let's take a look at every age in the Wheel of Time, talk about their major events, and discuss how they shaped the mythos of this series. And keep your spoiler hats on if you're a show-only fan, because there's going to be a lot of those in this video. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. First Age. The Wheel of Time is inspired by the Hindu and Buddhist concepts of reincarnation and the cyclical nature of life. Both Indic religions focus on the idea of souls being reborn in every new yuga or universal cycle, with there being various yugas. According to Hinduism, the yuga we exist in is called the Kali Yuga because it's the age in which humanity will face its reckoning. When the Kali Yuga ends, the cycle is renewed and the ages begin again from the first, which was the Satya Yuga, the best of the yugas. It's oddly comforting to know that we're in the final age according to Hinduism, but the way that this relates to the Wheel of Time is why you're here, so we're going to give it to you guys. The idea is simple. When the creator made the universe, he also created an antithesis to himself called the Dark One. He imprisoned this entity in a cage outside of the universe and space-time continuum, and he continued to seed life in the former. The creator took a non-interventionist stance because to it, free will was sacred. He wanted life to select whatever path it chose to take, but he bound the fates of all living beings to the Wheel of Time. This wheel has 7 gigantic spokes on it, and its turning is what turns the ages. Each spoke represents each age, and depending on where you are, the matters of a previous age might just lie in your future. However, one thing is clear, and that's the fact that there is a point of inception for this wheel, and Robert Jordan's universe seems to exist within the first full turning of it. Much of its events cover Earth, so yes, on Earth, several extinction-level events unfold, but the greater universe itself doesn't seem to die a death with each age like Earth does. Having said that, there are scarce details about the people of the First Age, or indeed the First Age itself, beyond fragments scattered across the series and Robert Jordan's personal notes. The clearest link to this age can be found in the form of the portal stones, which are clearly identified as First Age relics. These pillars, engraved with rune-like inscriptions, are slick to the touch and gray in color, but when you channel the One Power through it, it sends you to its sister portal stone, wherever it's located in the world. Because it uses the One Power, we can assume that this is a relic from a post-One Power discovery period, which we can speculate existed because of other artifacts we find in the series. In the Palace of the Panarch of Terabon, there are a couple of oddly familiar objects. The first is the skeleton of an animal with 4 legs and an abnormally long neck. The second is a curious 3-pronged star made of a strange yet extremely durable substance that radiates a sense of hubris. If you don't recognize these things, they're the remains of a giraffe and the Mercedes-Benz symbol respectively. The former went extinct thousands of years before the main story, which explains why the character who comes across it doesn't recognize it, and it's curious that the character also doesn't recognize the durable material that the Benz symbol is made out of, which suggests that it's plastic. There are also stories about famous humans from our time that have turned into legends in Wheel of Time's main story. There's the tale of Len, who flew to the moon in the belly of an eagle made of fire, and his daughter Salia, who walked the stars. Robert Jordan confirmed that these are references to the astronauts John Glenn and Sally Ride. Glenn was the first American astronaut to orbit Earth, and Sally was the first American woman to go to space, period. The fact that their stories have become myths in the main timeline tells us that our current reality is part of Jordan's First Age. There are tales of Mosk the Giant, who fought another giant called Merc with lances made of sword that could span the entire world. This is a reference to Russia and America's Cold War, and quite possibly the Cuban Missile Crisis specifically. There was a female monarch called Elsbert, remembered as Queen of All, which is most likely a reference to Queen Elizabeth II, during whose reign the British Empire was at its zenith. We hear of Matarize the Healer, Mother of the Wondrous Land, which is a not-so-subtle reference to Mother Teresa. And then there are the many heroes of the First Age that are summoned by the Horn of Valir. The horn is an artifact that seems to be connected to the Wheel of Time and the pattern it weaves. When it's sounded, it summons the greatest heroes ever produced by the pattern. They're not bound to the will of the horn sounder, but they are bound to fight on the side of the light and be led by the dragon in the end. Many spirits that reside within the Horn are from the main timeline's age, like Arthur Hawkwing, the man who united the world west of the Spine, but many of them are from this mythic First Age, like Michael of the Pure Heart, Hend the Striker, Padraig the Peacemaker, Siobhan the Hunter, and Calian the Chooser. When these heroes are summoned for the first time in the series, the characters can tell there's something very different about them. Michael, in particular, is recognized as Michael. Michael is just the name that sounds closest to Michael in the language of the Third Age. Michael of the Pure Heart is analogous to Saint Michael, and the rest of these heroes are famous saints, humans, and even gods. Hend the Striker is most likely John Henry, a legend from American folklore. John Henry was a steel driver without peer who died winning a competition against a machine drill with his hammer raised high. Hend the Striker's description is eerily similar to that of the famous statue of John Henry at the Great Bend Tunnel in West Virginia. Padraig the Peacemaker is a reference to St. Patrick, yet another quote-unquote ascended human, and the last two, Siobhan and Calian, are likely a reference to Shiva and Kali, the god of destruction and the goddess of death respectively. They're both involved in the Hindu version of the end of the world. Shiva in particular is called the Destroyer because one of his cosmic roles is to burn the universe to an end so a new cycle of yugas can begin. Shiva is also depicted as a hunter in many of the tales about him, so Siobhan and Calian being references to these ancient destroyer gods makes a lot of sense within the context of the series as well. One of the biggest questions people have about Wheel of Time is why does evil exist at all? If the creator is all-powerful, why does he allow evil to exist when he can easily wipe it out? The answer lies within his non-interventionist policy. Evil is as much a part of the natural order of things as good is. It's the creator's hope that his creations choose to be good of their own free will, no matter what age they live in. In that way, he's a lot like a human parent, but what does this mean for the First Age? Was it a time when gods and saints and humans walked the earth at the same time? Well, yes and no. The thing is, we only get to hear about how the First Age ended from the personal notes of Robert Jordan, and those were never really intended for public consumption. Jordan's notes were his way of fleshing out the story he was writing without throwing all of these details into his manuscripts, so this information isn't a part of the official canon, but it does make a lot of sense based on what we're about to say. So, Robert's notes tell us that the First Age ended when fire rained from the heavens, the land cracked open, and the air, water, and earth itself became poisonous to human existence. It's said that those whose flesh didn't melt were left with charred bones, and boils, sores, and plague were the norm. Fruits and freshwater sources were noxious, and the air itself was lethal to life. It's said that there were fumes that corroded man's flesh, and that to save itself, humanity stretched its fingers to the stars and seized them. But in doing so, it had become mightily presumptuous. So for that, man was, quote-unquote, purged of his greatness, purged of knowledge and abilities, and reduced to an animal to begin again the climb to light. This new man finally accepted the ultimate truth of the universe, that man's responsibility was to seek salvation from within, not to cling to gods or spirits to do it for them. Evil must coexist with good, for without either, free will collapses. And we're going to assume that it was at some point after this understanding was achieved that humanity returned to planet Earth. This paints an extremely grim picture of the First Age, which was essentially the Icarus of the bunch. Mankind became so technologically advanced that it became a galactic colonizing force. But its hubris led to the destruction of the Earth, and the fact they presumed to have power over many worlds was an affront to the natural order in and of itself. Based on the description of things, it feels like the Earth was decimated by nuclear warfare, because much of Jordan's anecdotes about the kind of effects the rain of fire had on the planet resemble the consequences of atomic warfare. This is consistent with how the pattern weaves the narrative of each age. There is a Genesis period where life explodes into existence, followed by a golden age which sees civilization thrive. But that golden age soon declines into depravity, and eventually, once the tipping point between good and evil is reached, the world breaks. After this breaking comes a reconstruction period where the leftovers of the previous age learn from the mistakes of that age and inscribe its stories into myth and legend. So, after becoming a race so technologically advanced it could conquer planets, humanity was swatted down by the Creator and made to acknowledge the dangers of playing with the fundamental elements of his creation. When humanity returned to Earth, which we know they did because the main series is based on Earth, they brought the power of channeling with them. At some point, out there in the cosmos, they understood that using the one power was the key to salvation. So, when they returned, they never went back to the atomic age. It's possible that the portal stones were created during the galactic era of this first age because they feel like alien technology, but they're powered through channeling. That would explain why there are no records of its existence anywhere on Earth, and also why no one can quite remember how they're made. It's also possible that there were channelers on Earth before all of humanity discovered channeling, because that would explain why figures like Shiva and Kali and Michael were revered as gods. It's said that the Horn of Valere also houses the soul of Amarisu, analog to the Japanese sun goddess Amaterasu, who is specifically identified as the female incarnation of the dragon spirit. It's said that whenever the pattern requires a female dragon to take over the narrative of the age, Amarisu's spirit will be reborn in the new one, much like how Luz Theron's soul is reincarnated in Randall Thor. Because people didn't understand that these guys were channelers, they became gods. But once all humans got access to channeling, worshipping gods became a thing of the past. They knew the truth of the universe now, that there was only one creator and that he did not wish for them to sing his praises. He only wished for them to find salvation on their own, which explains the reason behind the creation of several Second Age institutions. And speaking of the Second Age,
what did you think would happen?
Age of Legends. We say that at some point, someone set humanity on the path of coexistence because that's mostly what the Age of Legends was all about. This was a time when channelers were both male and female because their corresponding aspects of the One Power were still pure. In Wheel of Time, a female channels the Sidar of the One Power, and a male channels the Sidene. These two working in conjunction releases the best, most potent kind of energy, which highlights the spirit of cooperation that existed throughout the Age of Legends. This is further reinforced by the fact that the name Aes Sedai means servants of all. The Aes Sedai were established as a global organization to push humanity forward through peace and cooperation, and for thousands of years, mankind moves ahead, holding the hands of their brothers and sisters, not slapping them away. Earth is ruled from the capital city of Paran Disen, which is a haven of channeling and technology. Massive skyscrapers once existed in Paran Disen, and from the flashbacks we saw in episode 4, you can see that even Aiel carriages used to be a blend of modern and ancient technology, not straight-up Romani wagons. Humanity must have returned with some sort of secret from the space era because in the Age of Legends, they created all kinds of Angriel, Sangriel, and Terangriel. They also created sentient beings that are more than androids, but somewhat less than humans. Genetic engineering on sentient life beyond plants was banned, you see, and anyone caught doing such a thing was harshly reprimanded because that's what led humans to extinction in the first place. Or at least that was the mentality of the time. Instead, technology was focused on creating things that helped humans prosper, like the agricultural beings called Nims. The Aiel were a farming people during this era, and they often worked together alongside the Nims and the Aes Sedai to provide food to the world. Theirs was the way of the leaf, to not harm any living thing, even at the cost of their lives. That worked out during this age because progress and peace were the tenets upon which the Age of Legends was founded, and in this society all people were equal. The Aes Sedai were in charge of governing humanity, but unlike the main timeline, it wasn't a strictly female organization. Males and females, channelers and non-channelers were part of it, and you rose and fell in power based not on your family name, but based on your contributions to the betterment of mankind. And researching the secrets of the universe became an obsession for all. It was as an Aes Sedai researcher that Lanfear began her life during the Age of Legends. Back then, she was called Biren Elonire, and she worked out of the Kolam Dam facility where Randall Thor's first recognized ancestor tilled the lands. Mirren was a servant of peace and progress for centuries. Like many of her sisters, things weren't going to stay that way forever. Eventually, progress reaches stagnation if you don't diversify your areas of research, and that's exactly what happened to the people of the Age of Legends. They reached the ceiling of what they could do as channelers, having explored the Sidar and Sidene as much as they could. Eventually, a belief arose that the separation of male and female essences was what was holding back progress and leading society towards decay. The leadership tried to ignore it, but on the fringes of the world, humanity had started unraveling. The peaceful utopia of the Age of Legends had turned into a cover-up regime where the leadership refused to acknowledge the changes in society and instead doubled down on looking for a quote-unquote cure. Research facilities were open to look into the possibility of merging the One Power's two aspects or discovering a new power that removed the barriers created by Sidar and Sidene, and this is where humanity's hubris became its undoing once more. Lanfear used to be the partner of Luz Theron Telamon, the dragon of the Second Age, but along the way, she fell in love with being his girlfriend more than being in love with him. Mirren craved a third name for herself for centuries, but she didn't get one on account of her power-hungry nature. She was one of the strongest Aes Sedai in existence, but she also couldn't stop flaunting it. Her thirst for power was what led her and her research partner, Bae Domonto, to discovering the Dark One trapped in a dimension outside of space and time. Their facility was dedicated to finding ways of accessing the true source in a way that didn't divide it across gender lines. In their efforts, they scoured the pattern and came across the Dark One's prison instead. Column Dam created a metaphorical drill to bore through the pattern and get to the source of this unidentified power, but in doing so, the researchers doomed the universe. Unbeknownst to them, they'd just let the Dark One out of jail, and even though it was a small crack in a massive prison, it was enough to allow him to exert his influence somewhat unchecked. What followed is what shaped the current timeline of the main series, as the Dark One took oaths of fealty from humans willing to serve its agenda, thus creating the Forsaken. Mirren is the only chosen who picks her new name and calls herself Lanfear, Daughter of the Night. She accepted the Dark One's power because she wanted to make the world pay for not recognizing her contributions to it, and she wanted Lews Therin back. Her obsession with the dragon is reflected in her relationship with Rand, which the Amazon adaptation seems to be keener on exploring, but that's for another video. For now, let's talk about what humanity did in response to this calamity and how it created the world that Rand al'Thor is born in. Lews Therin was appointed the general of the Aes Sedai armies and tasked with defeating the armies of the Shadow. But with their shadow spawn constructs and their complete apathy towards the killing of other humans, the Forsaken eventually ran roughshod over the Army of Light. As a last-ditch effort, two plans of countering the Dark One's influence were proposed, each as dangerous as the other. The first was the construction of two extremely powerful Sangreal called the Choden Kal. Two halves would be constructed for a Saidar and Saidin user, and two access keys would be created as well. These keys would allow the Chosen to operate these artifacts safely because by themselves, they were powerful enough to destroy a planet. It was proposed that the Aes Sedai would use the Choden Kal to create a prison around the Bore, thus trapping the Dark One's influence to Sheol Ghul, where his power had manifested. The other plan was to create 7 seals, invoking the biblical seals, which would patch up the hole in the Bore and trap the Dark One along with his followers back in prison. Both plans were risky, but seeing as the latter would involve parties going directly to Sheol Ghul to apply the seal, it was decided that creating the Choden Kal was safer. To ensure that Lews didn't mess with this decree, a female Aes Sedai member gathered up all the rest of her sisters and created the fateful concord that forms the basis for their current existence. Tensions had already ramped up in society since the Dark One's appearance because it had triggered the collapse. Before his appearance, good and evil were decided through a man's nature and experiences. But now, evil was pervading the universe. Society had become more and more deceitful and savage with each passing year, and the fateful concord was one of the major events that signified its eventual collapse. Lews Therin was forced to fight losing battles to try and protect the project that was creating the Choden Kal, but when the facility was overrun by the Shadow's armies and the artifacts were lost, he put his plan of action into play immediately. To be fair to him, he had to do it because they had no other choice. The Aes Sedai had realized that the Forsaken's access to an undivided source of energy gave them far more endurance in a battle. If they had any hopes of winning, they'd have to strike hard and strike fast. To that end, Lews gathered 100 male Aes Sedai companions and journeyed to Sheol Ghul with an honor guard that was 10,000 strong. None of those men survived, and of the 100 companions, those who did unleashed terror upon the world. That doesn't mean their mission wasn't a success. The 100 companions managed to use pure Saidin energy to apply the 7 seals as well as they could, and for the most part, they got the Dark One back in his cage. Hell, they even got a bonus in the form of the Forsaken, who were present at Sheol Ghul when they began the sealing process. But the one power is 2 aspects of existence that work together as one. Using only half of it to seal an entity that is beyond it was a big mistake. The Dark One was trapped, but in his final act of vengeance, he used the incomplete nature of the seal to taint all of Saidin. Moreover, one of his Forsaken, Ishmael, was only sealed partially. This meant that he could act on the Dark One's behalf as long as he didn't get noticed by too many people. Ishmael is the one who established the Black Aja, the group of rogue Aes Sedai witches who are secretly dark friends like Liandrin and Naomi. As for Lews Therin, he went from being the savior of the world to its destroyer. The 100 companions were reduced to 68, but 68 male channelers driven to insanity by the Dark One's taint were more than enough to cause the breaking of the world. Lews killed his own family as well as every person in his estate in his madness. When the Forsaken Ishmael paid him a visit, his madness temporarily broke and he committed suicide because of the horrifying things he'd done. His rival, the woman who had created the fateful Concord, Latra Posey Dekume, rose to prominence as the Shadow Cutter after Luz succumbed to the shadow. His suicide created the Dragon Mount, which would become a nexus point for the next age. The second breaking lasted far longer than the first. According to Jordan's notes, the first breaking was a complete annihilation and reconstruction of life on Earth. The second breaking was similar, but not exactly the same. It lasted anywhere between 240 to 350 years, because the second breaking is measured by the time it took to kill the last living male channeler. The 100 companions were a tiny portion of all living male channelers, and all living male channelers were eventually driven insane by the taint of the Dark One. Their destructive power was so vast that they destroyed the continental landmasses of the Second Age and gave rise to the countries, nations, and islands that we know today. A group of Aes Sedai women who took to the sea ended up becoming the Sea Folk in the Third Age. It was during the second breaking that the Aiel began their long migration towards the Threefold Land, having been charged with the Aes Sedai to protect several powerful artifacts, including the access keys for the Choden Cow. These Aiel would eventually splinter into several groups, but after many generations, they would accomplish the ancient mission given to them when they established the City of Dreams, Ruidion. During the breaking, the Aes Sedai were splintered, and because of the taint, the idea of women-only Aes Sedai became reality. Even though they'd lost Perrin Dasen, they hadn't forgotten how to weave, and Saidar at least remained untainted. Separate Aes Sedai women started receiving foretellings about the dragon's inevitable rebirth, and because they remembered how Luz Theron had become humanity's worst nightmare, they created the policy of trying to bring the dragon under Aes Sedai control. The Aes Sedai also sealed the extremely powerful artifact Kalendor in the Stone of Tyr, using one power so pure that even the Forsaken are afraid of stepping within Tyr's fortress. The prophecies of the dragon started spreading through every culture that had a strong foretelling ability, like the Aiel, and after the death of the final male channeler, the Second Age truly came to an end. Unlike the First Age, where there was a clear transitional period, because we went to space, the Second Age was able to roll over to the Third with relatively fewer obstacles in their path. Yes, humans and their treekin, the Ogiers, have been brought to the brink of extinction. Many Ogiers had been separated from their steadings, and because it's a part of them, this eventually caused the problem of the longing, something our guy Loial is about to go through rather intensely. Humanity lost all of its technology to the breaking, including all channeling-based tech, save for the portal stones. They scattered all across the globe on the new landmasses and islands that had emerged and went back to a medieval societal system. This is the lens from which our main series is told, so let's talk about the Third Age. Third Age! The Third Age is the focal point of Wheel of Time, as we can spend an hour talking about all the things that happened just in this age. That's because it's the only one where comprehensive record keeping has been a thing. The First Age was a complete annihilation of Earth, and the Second Age took out all their tech, but since they were still on the planet and they had their stories and prophecies, they were able to rebuild society and write down the histories a lot better. An Aiel named Jonai was given the responsibility of seeing the Aes Sedai's strongest artifacts to a city where they'd be safe from evil hands. This cost the Aiel their original way of life as they splintered into three main groups. One of the groups left the mission to find new lands in the south. This group became the Tinkers, whom the modern-day Aiel wouldn't even give the respect of acknowledging for their cowardice. The second group was the Gen Aiel, who stuck to the Way of the Leaf until the very end and died because of it. The third group is the outcast group of Aiels who have become dominant today. This group was created by a man called Luin, who went against the Way of the Leaf and killed a few bandits in self-defense while he was trying to rescue his sister. Luin was deemed a stranger by his own mother, but he and his friends, who were exiled, decided to take up the spear and become the Gen Aiel's guardians. Eventually, Luin would be proven right, and the Aiel would continue picking up the spear in subsequent generations because a spear can kill, but it can also do many other things, unlike a sword. It's quite possible that the Aiel's honor system of Ji and To originates from the Way of the Leaf because the Aiel consider touching an enemy without harming them to be the greatest form of combat honor. Killing is easy, they argue, but a touch is the gentlest thing in the world. The Aiel used to be the gentlest of people, so it makes sense that that has been remembered as this most high form of honor. Both Jonai and Luin were Rand al'Thor's ancestors, which we saw when we went to Ruidion in the series, but these events began in the Second Age's final years and conclude somewhere around the Second or Third era of the Third Age. The Third Age is divided into three distinct eras: the After Breaking period, the Free Years period, and the New Era. Wheel of Time takes place during the New Era, with the Eye of the World being set in 988 NE. The rest of the story unfolds over a 2-year period, so we won't be going into that too much for reasons that should be obvious, but what we will do is give you a breakdown of how things got to where they are. The After Breaking period was a time of unprecedented human cooperation and power consolidation. All ages begin this way, when humanity tries its best to learn from the mistakes of the past and create a better future for itself. In the Second Age, they had the benefit of being a unified species for quite possibly the first time in human history. But in the Third Age, divisions occurred because every pocket of humanity that survived started viewing the world through its own lens, and unity is hard to achieve in such a diverse world. There are three main land masses in the Third Age. The landmass of Shan-Chan, whose inhabitants summoned creatures from parallel dimensions using portal stones to fend off the remnants of the Shadow Spawn. 3,000 leagues away from Shan-Chan's eastern coastline, separated by the Arith Ocean, lies the main continent where much of Wheel of Time unfolds. This continent has three parts, divided by two mountain ranges. To the west is the Westlands, and to the east is Shara, which is a unified land at the start of the Third Age. In the middle lies a desert wasteland, which is where the Aiel eventually settle. To the south is a third landmass that was discovered by the Sea Folk, but it hasn't been touched in centuries because of its inherent nature. Called the Land of the Madmen, this continent, about the size of Australia, is undergoing constant seismic activity. Male channelers haven't died out here, seeing as society in this continent is still stuck in a primitive era. Even the women are fierce and relentless, and outsiders are killed on the spot if they manage to make it to their shores. This continent is a remnant of the Breaking, because it's said that the Breaking never ended in the Land of the Madmen. But then, it didn't end north of these continents we've just described either. Shara is separated from Shan-Chan by another ocean that's about as large as the Arith Ocean, but both of these water bodies pale in comparison to the Mountains of Doom, which stretch across the entire northern hemisphere of the world. These mountains are a remnant of the Dark One's influence, and Sheol Ghul becomes the epicenter of the planet-killing disease called the Blight. This blight is one of the reasons why many Ogiers die away from their steading, because several Ogier steadings are trapped north of the Mountains of Doom. While Shan-Chan and Shara are unified by their respective peoples, the Westlands aren't so unified in spirit just yet. 10 kingdoms emerge from the Breaking, which in turn will grow into 29 over the next couple of eras, but even these 10 kingdoms were bound together by a pact of peace and trade. The dozen Aes Sedai survivor groups banded together and decided to re-establish their hold over the world, only this time Bene Gesserit style. The Amyrlin seat was created as a concept and a throne as a result of this agreement, and the 12 Aes Sedai groups wiped out any remnants to their authority. They selected the Dragon Mount as the backdrop of their new city, Tar Valon, which took 100 years to complete, but once it was made, the White Tower became an undisputed powerhouse in this new world. The Aes Sedai chose to govern this new age quite differently compared to the Second Age. For starters, because of the Sidene Taint, they only accepted female channelers among their ranks. Men were made warders at best, warriors who were bonded and sworn to protect a sister of the White Tower. The Amyrlin seat officially holds jurisdiction over the Aes Sedai alone, but unofficially, it's the Axis that makes the world spin, seeing as several Aes Sedai sisters end up becoming advisors to ruling families. It is also during this era that they start putting down men associated with the Dragon Reborn, with the first of them, Rowlin Darksbane, being defeated in 335 AB. Things seem to be going well for this new dawn of humanity, where they were definitely not as united as the Age of Legends, but were more cooperative than one would have expected them to be, considering the Dark One was loose. And then it happened. 1,000 years after the Breaking, Ishmael managed to sneak out of his partial seat and start influencing the world to prepare for the Dark One's inevitable return. He created the Black Ajah by manipulating sisters of the Aes Sedai and racked up several Dark Friends and Dreadlords, starting the Trolloc Wars that mark the end of the first Third Age era. 4 times do the Trollocs invade mankind's dominions over the course of 3.5 centuries, during which time another false dragon declares himself, but once they're defeated, the Free Years begin. Humanity adopts a new calendar and gets to work on reconstructing itself after the devastation caused by the Dark One's forces. The 10 kingdoms collapse, and in their place, several smaller kingdoms rise up, with seats of power like Shiota and Shandal becoming the new centers in the west. One man, called Arthur Paindrag, nicknamed Hawkwing, an obvious reference to King Arthur, unifies the Westlands into a single empire and rules over it for several decades. He creates invasion forces that are meant to subdue Shara and Shanchan as well, but he has no success with the former, and the latter expedition is presumed lost. When Artur dies, he has no living heirs, so a civil war breaks out, and this is when modern powerhouses like Andor and Terabon rise up. The Free Years can pretty much be called the Age of the Hawkwing because Artur Hawkwing dominated global politics. Unbeknownst to him, his eastern expeditions to Shanchan had been a massive success because his son, Luthair, managed to conquer the continent. He and his descendants established a brutal monarchical state in Shanchan, where their blood held the highest prestige. In the aftermath of his demise, Andor, Karheen, Ilion, Malkir, Burundi, and several other nations declared independence and engaged in a bloody war for supremacy. The War of the 100 Years reshaped politics in the Westlands and ended with 24 kingdoms of varying degrees of power in control of the realm. This is the context within which the new era begins, which is when our story is set. During the Free Years, the Aes Sedai are forced to contend with the rising threat of false dragons as well as enmity from the nobles. They'd managed to sneak their way into every center of power, but the rise of Artur Hawkwing coincided with the time when the Forsaken Ishmael emerges from the Boar. He manipulated Artur into attacking the Aes Sedai on several occasions and left Tar Valon besieged for the longest period in its history. Hawkwing never quite relied on the witches like he used to, even when he realized he was being manipulated by a Forsaken, because he came to believe that much of Ishmael's revelations were true. The Aes Sedai were manipulating things for their own benefit, and this realization is probably what led to the creation of the Children of the Light, who were established a quarter of the way into the War of the 100 Years. These fanatics, who worshipped light as the divine aspect of the One Power, detested the Dark One, but also the Aes Sedai for being so presumptuous as to use God's power for themselves. Their extremely militant mentality and religious fanaticism leads them to target both groups, and because they train themselves to be some of the best warriors in the land, there aren't many who oppose them. The Children of Light were able to enter the capital city of Amadisia and oust the king himself, throwing him to the outskirts, while they built the formidable Fortress of Light. The children rule their own from this fortress formally, but informally, they also rule Armador. Because of their many atrocities against suspected dark friends and the like, they've colloquially come to be known as White Cloaks, and while people are glad for their help against the forces of darkness, they don't care much for them apart from that. The new era is where everything starts kicking off in anticipation of the dragon's arrival. It's said that the pattern starts acting like a storm as it gets closer to that critical weave of bringing the dragon back, which is why the new era sees far more chaos and far too many false dragons rise up. Andor goes through multiple succession crises, and the Aiel both befriend and then destroy the Karheen for disrespecting their sacred trees. Moraine and Lan and Siwan and all the other key figures of our story are born in the second half of the New Era millennium, and every kind of evil in the world collides with one another until Rand is born. Then, when he declares himself the Dragon Reborn, the prophecies are confirmed, and everything falls into line as it's supposed to. The story of the final years of the Third Age sees Rand al'Thor unify and lead the forces of humanity against the Dark One as he struggles to maintain a grip over his own sanity. We would dive into this in more detail, but like we said, that could take an hour. So instead, what we'll do is talk about what happens at the end of the Third Age. At the end, the world is returned to a state before the bore was drilled because Rand realized that good and evil need to coexist for free will to truly be free. He restores the Dark One's prison and gives himself an out from being a channeler and a king, but before he gets his happy ending, Rand institutes one global decree, the Dragon's Peace. This peace is something he engineers to ensure humanity never walks down the path of destroying itself ever again. Rand tells every nation's leader to stop expanding their borders and sign treaties of cooperation with their neighbors in perpetuity. His own wives oppose him at first, but ultimately the Dragon's Peace is achieved. The Third Age comes to an end when Sheol Ghul is freed from the corruption that had been spilling out of it for millennia, and the Dragon's Peace becomes the norm of the world. Rand al'Thor, free from his bonds, rides a horse into a new dawn called the Fourth Age. Fourth Age! Now, realistically, we have no idea what the Fourth Age looks like because what it was supposed to look like is no longer relevant. But it could have been an age much worse than the Third because, at least there, all of humanity was consolidated by the spirit of unity. The Fourth Age begins with a war that decimates several of the empires that Rand brought together with his peace and is instigated by one of his own daughters. In Towers of Midnight, the penultimate installment in the series, penned by Brandon Sanderson, Aviendha goes through the glass pillars of Ruidion a second time and instead of being given a vision of the past, she's given a vision of the future. This happens because knowing what's on the horizon for the world, she wonders where the Aiel will go once the last battle is over, and what their future will be. What she finds is a nightmare where the Aiel are reduced to near mindless garbage-scrounging scavengers. Apparently, after the last battle, the Aiel were left out of the Dragon's Peace. Rand presumably did this because he knew how integral fighting was to their culture, but in doing so, he doomed them and fulfilled their destruction by his hand. 17 years into the peace, his daughter with Aviendha, Padra, starts the conflict that eventually destroys the remnants of the world known to us. A group of Shan-Chan wandered into the Aiel Waste without their permission, so Padra ended up killing them as was their custom. The Aiel took the Shan-Chan's arrival as an evil omen because the Exotic Empire had still not released the Wise Ones they'd captured before the last battle. The Aiel decided that since they weren't a part of the Dragon's Peace, it didn't apply to them, and they declared war on the Shan-Chan. Over the course of the next century, they were hunted out of their homes in the wetlands and the Aiel Wastes as the Shan-Chan Empire came to dominate the globe. Aviendha's granddaughter, Onkala, made a desperate bid to rally more support to her losing cause, seeing as the Shan-Chan were stomping the Aiel. She used plans she'd stolen from the Shan-Chan that showed contingency plans to deal with kingdoms like Andor should they enter the war on the Aiel's side to manipulate the kingdoms of the Westlands into siding with her. This destroyed the Westlands as we know them and made it a part of the Shan-Chan Empire. The Aiel tried turning east to Shara for help, but they sided with Shan-Chan as well, and even helped them wipe out the once great warrior clan. The last known descendant of Aviendha and Rand was a feral beast of a person called Melidra, who lived just a couple of centuries into the Fourth Age. We don't know if this was intentional on Brandon Sanderson's behalf, but Melidra basically means a dirty human in some Indian languages, and it's disgustingly fitting for the bottom feeder lifestyle that the last of the dragon's line was forced to resort to. Melidra was killed by a lightbearer who had a modern weapon that looks a lot like a musket, and the Shan-Chan's Raven Empire had made so much technological progress that they were setting up a railway line to connect the Westlands to Shara. So, while progress and consolidation is still a part of the beginning of any age's pattern, the context within which it's presented to us can either be uplifting or downright horrifying, like this possible future. By the time Aviendha experiences these visions, we've had many years to get to know the Aiel. Robert Jordan started the series in the 90s, and Brandon Sanderson finished A Memory of Light somewhere around 2013. People had a good amount of time to get familiar with and empathize with the Aiel, which is why Aviendha's vision evokes such visceral reactions in them. But from the perspective of the pattern, things were still going the way they were supposed to. In fact, in some ways, much better. The Shan-Chan rediscovered technology that had been dead for several thousand years within a few decades. They also created a treaty of cooperation with the only other power in the world, that being Shara. So, while the eradication of the Aiel was a bloody affair, the pattern itself held to its wider tenets. And after Aviendha revealed her visions to the Wise Ones, it must have changed course entirely. That's because the Aiel of the present begged Rand to include them in the Dragon's Peace, and promised never to raise their arms against Shan-Chan. Rand didn't understand their demand entirely, but he acquiesced nonetheless, appointing the Aiel as the arbiters of the peace. From that point onward, any and all disputes would be overseen by them, and given their customs and traditions, one could expect only the fairest of outcomes. This has most definitely altered the pattern because the foundation of Aviendha's vision was the fact that Rand didn't include the Aiel in his piece. Thematically, it shows you how peace for one should be peace for all, because if given the opportunity to do so, someone was bound to sow the seeds of war once again. Aviendha's vision showed his own daughter doing that, so now that the Aiel have sworn to never attack the Shan-Chan, we can forget about Rand and Aviendha's final descendant being a bottom-feeding human. Things will change, and heck, they might even develop a lot faster than the Raven Empire reality. Rand's peace also creates the prospect for all those technological advancements to come to the Fourth Age, and faster, arguably, seeing as war won't be dividing it anymore. So that's all we know about the Fourth Age, which will ostensibly last for a few thousand years as well. Although whether that'll be 3,000 years or several million years, it's hard to tell. The First Age was extremely long, but the Age of Legends was far shorter, and the Third Age lasted for only 3,500 years. Now, we know that's a long time, but it's nothing compared to Earth's history in real life, so it's quite possible that the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Ages got progressively shorter, and that one of them had a female dragon as their savior. We say this because the hero of the Horn, Amoresu, has been specifically identified as the female incarnation of the dragon's soul, and Robert Jordan wouldn't have planted that information in his series if he didn't mean for it to come up at some point in the future. And speaking of the future, Like we said at the beginning of this video, the Wheel of Time has 7 spokes which represent the 7 ages. We've discussed what happens from ages 1 through 6, but what happens in the 7th and final age? The Last Age! The Last Age has to be a time of such destruction that humanity either regresses back to being cavemen or are completely wiped out in favor of the Creator restarting the cycle of evolution. The Wheel of Time is, at the end of the day, a cyclical series. The 7th age is both going to happen and has happened. Death and rebirth and repetition is the way of life, so if the first age had everything starting over from scratch, then the last age should set up the conditions for that scratch. It's quite possible that the universe will experience heat death in this age, and then the first age will restart with another big bang. That's also reminiscent of how in Hinduism, Shiva is said to destroy the universe with his fiery Tandava at the end of Kali Yuga, and from the ashes, a new universe will arise, restarting the cycle. Marvelous verdict! So that's it for our coverage on all of the ages from the Wheel of Time. We know this video was probably a bit longer than you expected, so we appreciate your patience. Let us know your thoughts on the nature of time and ages in this franchise down in the comments section, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Wheel of Time content. Thanks for sticking with us right to the end of this one, and as always, stay safe out there and have a marvelous day.